Is your job search stuck? Maybe you're not getting any interviews with employers. Or maybe you are, but no job offers. Or you may be new and not even know where to start. This is Charles Max Wood, and I'm releasing a new course and ebook on how to find a job as a software developer. The course walks you through the process of finding the types of companies you want to work for, getting their attention, and putting your best foot forward as the candidate they want. I've coached dozens of developers in looking for jobs and have been able to help several people find jobs within 2 weeks to 2 months. So whether you're new to development, can't find a great job that fits what you want, or are looking for remote work from an area without a strong tech community, I can help. Go to getacoderjob.com and sign up today. Hi, this is Charles Max Wood, and I've been asked more times than I can count, how do I stay current? There's a lot to this question, and I'm working on a solution: code badges. That's right, you heard me right. Basically, the idea is that you come and do a code badge, and that gets you an introduction to a topic. Then you can decide if you want to pursue it further. But while working on the badge, you gain enough proficiency to be able to pick it up again if you need. A lot of technology comes through on the bleeding edge, and not all of it sticks, but the principles do. So doing badges on the technologies that will get you ahead will provide you with experience needed to stay competitive. Plus, it offers social proof that you know something about the topic. The project is on Kickstarter right now. You can support it and get on the launch list at codebadge.org.
Hey everybody, and welcome to our very first My Angular story. I recorded about 3 of these for JavaScript Jabber, and this is the first one I'm doing for Adventures in Angular. So I'm going to kind of talk you through the format as we go, just so that you, the listener, can get used to this. Our first Angular story is from Tero Parviainen. I hope I said that kind of correct.
That was pretty much perfect, yeah.
Do you want to give everybody just a brief introduction before we get rolling?
Sure, yeah. So I'm a front-end developer from Helsinki, Finland, doing a lot of Angular in the last 3 or 4 years, and I'm mostly working as an independent contractor with many different companies around the world, but I also do a lot of writing and speaking around the things that I do. But mainly a working front-end developer.
Yeah, and we've met in person a few times at the various Angular conferences. I think you were at NGNL.
Yeah.
And
we met there.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I try to catch as many as I can, and there are a lot of great Angular conferences these days, which is great.
Yep. You've also been on Adventures in Angular twice. So if people are looking for those episodes, you were on episode 51 talking about the Angular 1 compiler, and you were on episode 117 talking about hot loading and time travel, which was kind of a cool deal with Webpack and NGRX and all that awesome stuff.
Yeah, that's a lot of fun.
Yep. So I sent you the questions, and I'm just going to start with the first one, and we'll just kind of move through these. I tend to ask the question, and then if there's something that I want to pull on or push on, then I'll ask other questions as we go. So the first question that I ask is, how did you get into programming?
Yeah, okay. So my very first intro to programming was when I was about 7 or 8, when we got a Commodore 64 computer. Or my mom and dad bought one for me and my brother, which we mostly used for playing games and doing things like that. But it also had a basic interpreter on that machine, so an interpreter for the basic programming language, which I played with a little bit. So we had these programming books written in Finnish that had code listings for things like basic text adventure games and things like that. And I used to sort of painstakingly copy that code to the basic interpreter from those books and spend a lot of time on that. I don't really call that programming because I had no idea what the code was about. I just copied it, and when it didn't work, I had no idea what to do with it. But I think it made some neural connections even back then that turned out to be useful later. But that was pretty much the extent of it until my adulthood, when I actually really got into programming, which was when I was in my early 20s, and that's when I got my first internship doing software development. And so this was in 2001. It was at the middle of the big IT bubble that was going on back then in the mid or the turn of the century. And I was lucky to be looking for internships back then because they were hiring everyone. At that point, that didn't even have to kind of know how to code to be hired as a coding internship. So I got my first job as a Java programmer back then, and I've been doing that ever since. Well, not coding Java, but working as a working programmer since 2001.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. And it's funny that, I mean, you hear these stories, right, of people that were like, oh yeah, I mean, I remember I started programming when I was 2 and,
Yeah.
or 7 or 8, right? But yeah, you kind of got exposed to it and then you came back to it as an adult. And I think
Right.
a lot of people get this in their head that there are people who are made for programming and then people who are not made for programming. And I find that to be just patently false. And, you were exposed to it. It was kind of a fun thing for a little while. And then you came back to it as an adult and it was like, oh, okay, I actually like this enough to want to do it full time.
Yeah, definitely. I agree that there's no sort of natural kind of skill or whatever you want to call it that anyone has. It's just something that your environment exposes you to it, and you kind of start doing it, or you don't. But anyone can do it. There's nothing magical about it.
Hey there, this is Charles Max Wood, and I just wanted to talk to you really briefly about Freelance Remote Conf. I'm putting on a conference for people who want to go freelance or who are freelance, and bringing in some of the experts from the Freelancer Show to talk to you about how to find clients, how to collect money, how to build your business, how to specialize, and much, much more. So if you're thinking about going freelance or you're already freelance and want to hear from the experts on how to go, become, or grow your freelancing business, then by all means, come check us out at freelanceremoteconf.com.
So how did you wind up going from Java to Angular? The next question is, how did you get into Angular? But
So from the very beginning, when I started working, I've been essentially doing web applications or different things that people use with web UIs. And even with Java, that was always web apps done with Java frameworks of the time. And then when Rails came around, I got onto that bandwagon pretty early on. I was doing a lot of Ruby for many years, and then a bit of Clojure when that came out. And so with those, it kind of started to veer more towards the front end, of course, when the Ajax things came about and all those things. But Angular was then actually kind of late. It was, I think, around 2013 when it was already really big and being used a lot. Until then, I'd done some front end stuff with Backbone and a little bit with what was the precursor to Ember called?
Sprout Core.
Sprout Core, yeah, a little bit of that and some Google Web Toolkit. But in 2013, we were starting a new project and we were looking at doing the basic questions about which framework should be used, and the options were really, I guess, Angular, Backbone, Ember. And we settled with Angular with that one. I think it was mostly because it was really the most popular one at that point. There was a lot of hype, so it felt like a kind of safe thing to do. So I can't say it was really after a lot of technical, consideration. But that's what we did then, and it turned out to be a pretty good choice because, well, here I am now.
Yeah, that makes sense. So were there particular things that made you want to learn Angular, or was it just the popularity and stability of the system?
Well, there were some things like the data binding was a new concept for me back then, after having used Backbone and having spent a lot of time figuring out how to basically wire things together so you could get your model changes shown in the views, and making all of that work in a clean way. That was kind of a problem that the previous frameworks that I'd used hadn't solved, and that was kind of what interested me most. But the rest of it was really just that everyone kept saying that you need to try this, and this is really cool.
Yeah, I remember when Ember came out, and the story with Ember and the reason that I didn't go with it, versus Angular was what you're kind of describing with the data binding and some of the other powerful features that it had. Ember's powerful feature was just managing data and keeping it all sort of in sync. And
right.
That was not the problem that I needed solved in the immediate term, and so when I was exposed to Angular, that's where I went.
Mm-hmm.
Which is funny because the guys that built Ember are actually Yehuda Katz was on the Rails core team and modeled a lot of stuff after Rails, so it was very familiar. But
right, yeah, and it really shows they kind of have a lot of the same philosophy as Rails does around the convention over configuration, and really early on they even had those really good CLI tools, which are only now coming into Angular, right? They've been in Ember since the very beginning.
Yep. But that said, I mean, I can definitely see the sets of problems that you're going to want to plug Ember in instead. But yeah, it's
right. Yeah.
It's kind of an interesting thing. I also want to just point out that there are some parallels between your story and mine, just from the sense of when I got in, I got into Rails, and then I was using Backbone and tried some of these other systems and eventually got hooked on Angular.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, there was a lot of interesting things that happened with front end in the early days of Rails, even before Backbone, when we started doing this interesting, JavaScript live updates of the page with this, where they are RJS templates and things like that, which turned out to be a lot of work to maintain. But back then it felt like magic, because those were things that you really hadn't been able to do before. Make things move on the page and update right on the page. That was really interesting and fascinating time.
Yeah. So the third question is, since you've gotten into Angular, what kinds of things have you contributed to the community, or what kinds of things have you done that people should know about?
Mm-hmm. So my contributions with Angular and JavaScript in general are mostly around writing. I am not a huge open source maintainer or contributor. I have like minor things I've contributed to both of the Angulars, but it's mostly around writing. And the biggest project there was this book that I wrote and self-published called Build Your Own Angular JS, which is a relatively popular book, more popular than I expected it to be, and seems to be well liked by the people who actually read it. And so that book was all about learning the Angular framework by building your own version of it. And it takes this very methodical way of doing it, where you do it with test-driven development. For every feature you add, you write a failing unit test, and then you implement that feature into the framework. And then as time goes by, as you go deeper into the book, you amass your own kind of version of this core Angular framework. But more importantly, you build up a mental model of how Angular works with that process. And that book was a huge project. I started it in early 2014, and I only really finished the book this year. And it became this 1,000-page monolith, which I don't think that many people have actually finished, but those who have, I think, are real Angular experts by now. So that's kind of the biggest writing project. And on top of that I've done a bunch of blog articles on my blog about JavaScript and Angular, and the ones that have kind of found the biggest audience are one was that one that I wrote in 2014 called How I've Improved My Angular Apps by Banning NG Controller, which was about this whole idea of starting to put your UI code into these components that were built with directives back then, instead of using scope inheritance and the kind of raw scope stuff and controllers. And that was something that was really in the air back then, but I kind of managed to write a post about it at the right time, which kind of captured the zeitgeist. And of course, that's something everyone does right now by default, but it really wasn't the way things were done before that time.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because that's exactly the direction that Angular 2 took.
Exactly, yeah, that's where we are now. And Angular 1 also has these APIs for that style of development now, and that's what's kind of really the encouraged way of doing Angular 1 as well. But it wasn't there at first.
I want to dig into your book a little bit. So what possesses somebody to say, oh, I'm going to write a book, build your own Angular? How did you get there?
So it started, first of all, it was at the same time when I was kind of learning Angular myself, and I had real trouble kind of understanding how it worked. Angular 1 was a framework that sort of clearly wasn't originally designed to do all the things it's doing right now. It's kind of built up over the years, and the abstractions there are quite leaky, and there's a lot of API surface area there. So it's kind of hard to figure out things like how directive compilation works, or how transclusion works, or how many of the features work. So I just felt that it's a good strategy to actually dig into the code and see what it's doing, because then you really understand it. So I wrote an article about that, about the change detection, and that kind of was received so well that I thought maybe I should kind of write more about this. And that was at the same time when I had just turned an independent consultant from an employment, and I was kind of toying with this idea of having some sort of passive income as well, on top of the consulting. So that's where a book project might help, and connecting those together just then became that book. And I published it pretty much right away with the first chapter, so as kind of a beta book that people could kind of start purchasing and getting updates as I was able to kind of write more chapters into it, and that kind of became the model. Most of the people who actually bought the book bought it way before it was finished, and they got these updates, basically a subscription model. But yeah, it worked out. I learned a lot of Angular. I sort of became an expert in Angular, and then also made some money with it.
Nice. So what was your process for writing the book? For coming up with the code examples and then sitting down and explaining to people how it all worked. That seems like a lot of work as well.
It was a lot of work. So I kind of had these rough chapter ideas of on this chapter I'm gonna add transclusion or something like that. And then when I started working on that chapter, the first few days or sometimes weeks were really just about understanding the original Angular code around that feature by looking at the actual source code and the unit tests that they have, and the documentation, and just in general how that API works. And then once I've understood that, then it was a process of, okay, what's the kind of sequence of unit tests that allows you to add this feature incrementally, so that I could kind of introduce it in the book in a way that the reader can sort of add one unit test and then make that pass, and kind of follow this TDD pattern along the way. So it was also about trying to sequence the addition of the feature in a way that makes sense, which is not necessarily the same that was used by the original implementers of that feature. But yeah, it was this process of understanding the feature, then figuring out the sequence, then coming up with the actual tests and the code, and then writing the narrative around that for the book. That's kind of what I repeated for every chapter.
How long did it take you to finish it?
It took, well, I started in January 2014, and I think that it came out of beta May this year, so that was more than 2 years.
Oh wow!
So it was a lot of time. I didn't get to spend as much time at some periods that I should have during that time, but I still, yeah, it was. I don't even want to think how many hours I spent on that, but it was a lot. It was a lot. It was a lot bigger project than I expected it to be.
Right. That's really, really interesting. So one other thing I want to talk about briefly is your talk at NGConf this year with the music app. That was really fun. And I'm kind of interested. I know we talked about this on the episode of Adventures in Angular, but yeah, I mean, it seems like such a frivolous thing, and everybody gets so focused on doing something that has like big value to the world or whatever. So why build this little toy?
Sure. So I guess there are many reasons. One of them was that this is just something that interests me a lot, basically doing music, and especially this idea of making autonomous systems that make music automatically. This is kind of idea that comes from experimental music that's used a lot by some composers and things like that, which kind of is very interesting to me as a programmer who is not a musician, who is seems like I'm not gonna ever kind of properly learn to play any instrument because I just can't bring myself to kind of do that practice.
Right.
So a way for me to do music would then be to use my existing skills, which is programming and especially web development. So that's kind of where I come from. But there is also this very utilitarian purpose of it, which is you can do musical applications in order to learn the technology that you're using. So with that NG-Conf talk and then with the NG Europe talk I did 6 months later, I basically used these musical apps as a way to explain RxJS and reactive architectures, because it really gives your brain an interesting way to kind of understand what's going on in the app when you can actually hear these events that are taking place in those observables or whatever. It's a very visual way of learning an architecture. So it helps a lot with that as well, even if you're not sort of interested in the music making itself. That's another one. And well, the reason I really went to NG-Conf was I wanted to go, but I knew that if I submitted and was accepted, I would have to spend pretty much all of my spring to prepare that talk, because it's a really big opportunity and a large conference. So I wanted to pick a topic that, if I get accepted, I really wanted to spend that time on, and I probably wouldn't get accepted though. But they did accept me, so that's how I ended up there.
Nice.
I didn't really expect that to happen, but I'm really glad it did, because that sort of then led to many other things that I've been doing in the same area since then.
Very cool. I also want to ask, just because I know some people, especially people who are new and trying to prove that they can provide value, how important is that sense of play in programming? Because it felt like you were not just doing it because, oh, well, I wanted to learn how to make music and I wanted to learn these specific things. It was also because it was fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's also because it's fun, and play, itself, it's just something that's built into us, the drive to play. We see it when we look at children, but often when we come into adulthood, we sort of don't find ways to give us the permission to play as much as we used to. Maybe with computer games it's different, but many other things we sort of always feel bad we're not doing something productive. But it's a really important thing to do. But again, it has this other side which is more practical, which is that you do learn a lot of stuff while playing, which is what I just talked about with the reactive stuff. And that's kind of also, I think, the underlying reason why children do play. They don't think of it that like that, but when they play, they are learning ways to deal with the world and to behave with other people and all kinds of things. And that's where play kind of works kind of as a method we use to learn stuff. And that's a method we can apply also when we learn technical things.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the final question before we do picks is, what are you working on now?
Yeah, so for work, I'm working on this React project with a customer, but apart from that, the kind of more interesting stuff is really these musical things that I've been doing throughout the year, really. So I've done a bunch of different web apps around music and visualizing music and producing sounds with the web audio. So there's a number of articles I've written, some talks, and also through that I've learned a lot about making SVG and canvas graphics using JavaScript, and also Angular, which is something I just talked about at NGBE, and also published an article about. But it's the thing that interests me right now is this whole historical thread of generative music and how I might be able to kind of do those things in the browser using everyday technologies.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned that you're working on a React project right now, and at React Remote Conf, we had a talk on React Music. Have you played it with that at all?
Oh, the Ken Wheeler project with the... I haven't played with it. I do know about it, and it seems really cool. It's kind of another example of where you apply a technology such as React and React components to something that it really wasn't designed for, to do something fun, essentially to play with it, during which you learn a lot about how components work in React and how music works. So that's a great example of the same kind of idea, but I haven't really played with that so much. But what's really also interesting about that is that when you combine that with the hot loading stuff in React, where you can make changes to components and have them applied immediately, you can essentially do live music performance with that as well, which is really not what those tools are meant to do. But when you do that, that's how it comes out. So you can just play samples.
I think there was actually a part of that to his talk, so it was kind of fun to watch.
Right. Yeah, it's a really fun project.
So you mentioned that you're a consultant. So if somebody's listening to this and saying, I need to hire Tero, how do they find you?
They can find me by going to my website, teropi.info, and there's an email address, I think, right at the footer of that website if they want to send me an email, or they can tweet. I'm on Twitter all day, every day, basically.
All right.
Hey, everybody. This is Charles Max Wood. I just wanted to talk to you really briefly about JS Remote Conf. We just picked speakers. Things are looking really good, and we're really excited to cover a broad range of topics for JavaScript developers. So if you're looking to learn things about Node.js, about becoming a better developer, about deployment, about mobile development, and much more about JavaScript, then come check us out at jsremoteconf.com. You can also find it by going to devchat.tv/conferences and then picking the conference you want. We have last year's recordings there. We have this year's conference coming up, so make sure you get your ticket, and we'll see you there.
Well, let's go ahead and jump into the picks. You've been on the show a couple times, so you know what picks are. Are there some things you want to shout out about that you've enjoyed the last little while?
Sure. Yeah, sure. There's actually a couple of books that are related to each other that I would like to mention because they sort of relate to something I've started to do very recently. So these books are both from Manning, and the first of them is called Functional Programming in JavaScript, and the second one is called Functional and Reactive Domain Modeling. So the first one kind of does what it says, which is kind of introduces functional programming concepts for JavaScript language, from basic things like functions and immutable data to more sophisticated things like functors and monads and all kinds of things. And the second one, Functional and Reactive Domain Modeling, is about this whole idea of domain-driven design, which is a way of designing domain models that's really strong in the object-oriented community, and bringing that over to functional programming. And that book is in Scala, but the ideas in it apply to many languages, I think. And the reason I picked these two is I think that there's a really good combination for maybe starting to do functional domain models in JavaScript when you kind of take those techniques from both those books. And especially when you then apply these to things like TypeScript and RxJS, I think with this mix, there's a really good kind of way to start doing really rich and really sophisticated domain models in for example, Angular applications, which is something that's really always been very underrepresented in Angular discourse because, the Angular framework doesn't give you any tools for doing domain modeling. So right. That means most people don't just end up doing none of that. And there aren't any domain models in many Angular apps, but many Angular apps could really benefit from that. And I think here's a mixture of books and technologies that help actually applying this thing to the front end, things like domain-driven design, in a way that's also very chimed really well with what's going on in JavaScript right now in general, which is discussions about immutability and functional programming and reactive data flows. So that's really an interesting combination to me. And I've started reading those books right now, and I'm trying to get as many people to read them with me so we can have a discussion about this.
Cool. My picks are much less technical. So on Saturday, my wife and I went and saw Rogue One, which is the new Star Wars movie. And it was pretty good. I really enjoyed it. Had a good time. So yeah, I'm going to pick that. I also picked this on Adventures in Angular this week, but there is an article on the internet that talks about how much it would cost to power the Death Star. And so it talks about, how much it costs to do laundry for all those people and feed all those people. And then, of course, how much it costs to power up the weapon and how much it costs to jump to hyperspace and things like that. It was like 6 octillion pounds because it's British pounds. But anyway, I don't know how many dollars that is, but it sounds like a lot. So it was pretty interesting, and I really enjoyed that aspect. And then the other pick I have is In about 2 weeks, I'm going to be at CES 2017. CES used to stand for Consumer Electronics Show until they said it doesn't anymore. But anyway, so it's all of the newest and neatest gadgets and gizmos. I've probably got about a dozen emails from VR companies in my inbox saying, come see our stuff. And then there are a whole bunch of health and other systems out there, home automation systems or smart home systems. And I'm really looking forward to digging into those, seeing what kind of makes them work, and finding ways that we as programmers can enhance the capabilities there and see what they can do. So I'm going to pick that, and I'm going to enjoy a couple of days in Las Vegas. And I guess that's it. Are there any other good places for people to see what you're working on, Tero, before we wrap up?
Not really. Everything I do, I share on Twitter, so that's really the place where anyone who wants to talk to me can find me.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming and talking to us.
Thanks for having me.